In this video, I'm going to demonstrate a long burn in the Ideal Steel wood stove. In this case, it's going to be an overnight burn, and once I load the stove, the next time I will load it will be between 10 and 11 hours later. So you'll get to see what things look like after a long duration burn, and I'll try and capture, at least over the initial part of the burn, the behavior of the stove through the process. So let's get rolling. All right, so let's go ahead and open up the stove. And as you can see in here, we actually have some remnants of a log. Just kind of stir this up a little bit. This piece here is an older piece of poplar that's been in there for a bit. All right, so we got some coals in there. And now we'll go ahead and load the stove. You'll notice as I load the stove, the smoke flap there at the top of the loading door opening, and you'll see that the pieces of wood are hitting that. Eventually here I will flip it up out of the way. So that piece apparently is useful in some installations to prevent smoke from spilling out. I find it's not necessarily super helpful unless you've got wood that's already started to catch a little bit. There, I just flipped it up out of the way, and it can actually stay up in that position. I've just finished loading the stove. It is 8:03 p.m. Right now the draft control is fully open, bypass is open, and we're just starting to get a little bit of flame catching that piece of wood in the front. The stove right now is loaded with 4 pieces of maple, a piece of cherry, and 2 pieces of poplar. And the 2 pieces of poplar are on top. So it's now 8:19. We have solid flames going on in here now, but the bigger thing that I want to point out is that the catalyst based on the probe thermometer is now up around 700. That probe is not necessarily super accurate, but that means we're well into the active range for the catalyst. And just to jump up, looking at the single wall stovepipe temp, very close or just under 250. So I'm actually going to close down the draft control here a little bit. We'll go down to a little under 3/4. And I am going to close this bypass and engage that catalyst. Now 8:36, the draft control is still set just under 3/4 open. It's now time to reduce things, so I'm going to take it all the way down to 1/4 open right there, and then a little later I'll drop it probably another 2 tick marks down. That'll slow the fire down. The catalyst probe thermometer, you can now see, is up around 1,000. Again, I don't put a lot of stock in that number, but looking at the stovepipe temp there, just above 250, that's actually been holding quite steady. And the stove top, if you can see right there, around 450. And again, that magnetic thermometer is not perfectly accurate. As the temperature rises, it can be 50 to as much as 100 degrees high. Like this will read 650 to 700. When the stovetop is with my infrared temperature gun is only 600 or so, but gives me a good indication. So anyway, things are settling in pretty nice. We'll probably back it down one more time in a little bit. Well, I think a quarter open on the draft control might be where we stay tonight. So far, not very interesting. Flames have actually pretty much died away. I should point out that it is mild outside. It's actually in the upper 30s, and tonight's lows are just in the low 30s above freezing. So draft isn't necessarily pulling really hard because it's not so cold out. The combustor right now, the catalyst probe is reading about 1500 degrees, and the stovepipe just under 300. I'll show that in a second. And the stove top, the magnetic thermometer, is reading about 600, which means it's probably around 550. So coming from a non-catalytic stove before this one, which is hybrid, you would never want to see your firebox like this with no flame at all. But in this unit with the catalytic combustor, it's actually still cleaning those emissions and giving that hot stove top, even though there's no flame in the box. So that's going to give a longer burn and extract every bit of possible heat that we can out of that wood. Let's take a look at the temps. As I just mentioned, that single wall stovepipe, right around 300. It's actually probably a little bit warmer than what that magnetic thermometer is reading right now. I've been noticing that my infrared sensor reads a little bit higher than that thermometer tends to. And the stove top, this magnetic thermometer tends to read higher than actual temps. So 600 there means that the actual stove top's probably right around 550. And like I also mentioned, that catalyst probe is showing that it is around 1500, 1600 degrees in there. Again, I don't know how accurate this is because I've seen this go up off of that scale, even though all the other temps on the stove are fine, particularly when I have both secondary combustion and the catalyst working together. I called Woodstock about that, and they did not seem concerned given all the other temperatures that I've been observing on the stove. It's now just after 9:40, and a couple of minutes ago I actually cheated and I opened up the draft a couple notches just for maybe 15 seconds or so, just enough to kind of kick things up and actually trigger off some secondary combustion in the firebox, because it's not all that interesting looking at a black firebox without any flame. So once that got triggered off, I then backed the draft control here back down. So we're 2 notches essentially below a quarter. I've been finding that that setting works pretty well in terms of going steady like this. Again, just a few minutes after 9:40, you can see now that the probe thermometer is actually reading about 1700, pretty much maxed out on the scale there. But the front of the stove, just figure I'll show this. If I shoot the stove right there, right next to that probe, somewhere around 575 Fahrenheit. And then as we look at the top here, you'll see that's showing about 650. But if I get up here with my infrared, it's about 100 degrees cooler than that. So around 540. Very nice temperature. It's been holding steady there now for quite a while. And that pipe thermometer is reading, well, 325 or so. And if we go ahead and shoot the pipe, again, we're seeing a little over 300. And if I go right over here, similar, a little over 300. So holding nice and steady there as well. It's just before 10:30. The stove top has fallen back about 100 degrees. The pipe is now just under 300, so that's fallen back a little bit. And the combustor probe is now reading about 1500. So you get a little bit of flame in that firebox. You start burning some of that smoke down in the firebox, and the catalyst temperatures do drop a bit, or the exhaust temperatures coming out of that combustor. So this is now the slow ride down. We'll let this thing cruise for the rest of the night. So at this point, I'm gonna sign off for the night. We'll come back and take a look at this in the morning. It's now 6:22 a.m. Go ahead and open the draft all the way. In terms of temperature, the catalyst probe is reading 500 basically. Coming on up to the stovepipe, maybe 140, 150. And looking at the top here, reading just a hair under 200. This is very typical in the morning for, about 10 hours later. Next, we'll open the door and take a look inside. So, as you can see, just some remnants of last night's load here. And let's stir this up. Sift a little bit of the ash down through the grate. And at this point, we're ready to put in a few pieces for today. So for this morning, I actually just loaded 5 pieces of poplar. I don't really care about having the best burning wood during the day, but now we just repeat the process. We let the stove warm up, we close the bypass, we back down the draft. As you can see, the flame is just starting to kick up in the stove behind me. And this will go for most of the day. I'll probably put in 3 pieces or so mid-afternoon to carry me until I load it for the overnight. So that's how this stove is performing for me so far in terms of a long duration burn. Don't even need to stuff it full to get basically 10 plus hours out of it. So pretty pleased with that performance.